Good afternoon, evening, or morning. I'm Barbie Zelizer, Director of the Center for Media at Risk here at the University of Pennsylvania's Annenberg School for Communication, and I'm very excited for you to meet Center Postdoc LaCharles Ward. LaCharles comes to us from Northwestern University, where he received a PhD in Rhetoric and Public Culture in the School of Communication and a certificate in African American and Diaspora Studies in the Department of African American Studies. LaCharles studies Black visual and cultural studies, focusing on how the nuanced crafting of language, rhetoric, image, and message system both grants and denies power to users. His particular interest has been in photography and film, and in the granular ways by which visual images draw from past traumas and difficult collective memories to embed and project larger messages than what we see. To that end, he has 4 publications and 3 more in progress, and has won awards, given public talks, and coordinated no less than 5 conferences on Black temporalities and territories, globalizing race studies, and cinematic imagery. Today, he's going to talk with us about how Black life, now and also long ago, cannot be imagined without a clear understanding of Black death. And he'll do so via the prism of one photographer and artist who powerfully invests in the past to push back against the current default landscape on which Black lives evolve. Carrie Mae Weems. Please welcome LaCharles Ward as he speaks on The Lively Dead, Carrie Mae Weems, Photography, and Black Life's Requiem.
Thank you so much, Barbie, for that introduction, and thank you all for videoing in to hear me talk today. And I'm actually quite excited to talk about sort of Black death, even though that, as we even sort of work through the mass amounts of Black death related to the coronavirus, and what it means to sort of really think about how to imagine life and such spaces of hurt and pain. In this talk, it thinks differently related to more state-sanctioned violence. And so I really appreciate the introduction, Barbie, and I thank you all for being here. And I welcome any sort of feedback on this sort of talk, which is part of a larger book project where I am in much more of a sustained engagement with a large body of Carrie Mae Weems' work at the intersections of law, photography, and Black studies is really where my research sort of aligns. And so I'm going to go ahead then and get started. My research program is driven by 2 questions. What are the political, social, and cultural conditions that structure Black contemporary life? And what new analytics, methods of inquiry, and conceptual analysis are required to interpret the archives of precarious Black life? The former is a cultural and historical question, while the latter is a methodological and theoretical question. For the purposes of this paper, I want to make 2 points that are necessary for following the arc of today's talk. First, I position death as a crucial object of study that performs cultural, political, and rhetorical work. In her essay, Regarding the Dead, rhetorical scholar Michelle Bailiff argues that regard, quote, denotes looking or viewing, but it additionally carries the significance of guarding, as in to watch over, end quote. I take seriously Bailiff's contention that, quote, regarding the dead, guarding them, and mourning them is the ethical relation that makes any rhetorical address possible, end quote. The driving proposition here is that scholars must take seriously the rhetorical work of Black death, and of course, this is the sort of argument that I am making, not the argument that Michelle Bailiff, but I depart from her insistent that we tend to death as an important object of study. By arguing that death is the condition of possibility for Black life and for thinking Black life, I'm fundamentally claiming that there is no way to truly write a history of Black life in and of the present if it does not take seriously Black death. Indeed, this is not so much of a new argument as it is a recentering and expansion of arguments made by Black feminist and literary scholar Carla Holloway. And passed on American Morning Stories, Holloway writes, quote, Black death and dying have cut across and through decades and centuries as if neither one mattered more than the incoherent associative presence of the other. Even if the story is grief-stricken, the act of memorializing retains a particular aspect of a culture's narrative. And for Blacks in the Americas, some notion of racial memory and racial realization is mediated through the veil of death, end quote. The history of Black life is one intimately associated with its antonym, Black death. Phrases like that will recur throughout this paper. One may think of it as a misshapen repetition, but it's a very much an intentional repetition, so that we hold on to both of those. They hung in a singular balance. Thus, to talk about Black life and Black people who tried to live, to make do, to survive, then cannot be disarticulated from its twin, death. Black living was always to be understood as life in death, or what I call Black shadowed life in my larger project, but what I refer to here rather evocatively, the lively dead. Second, in the same way that I'm interested in the ontology of Black death, so too am I interested in the ontology of photography more generally, and Black photographic practices in particular. Whereas Holloway focused primarily on literary texts, I make a departure by turning my attention to archives of Black visual culture, following scholars such as Jasmine Cobb, Krista Thompson, Nicole Fleetwood, Tina Camp, and others. I argue that we must engage the social life of photography. The social life of the photo not only refers to the, quote, social, cultural, and historical relationships figured in the image, end quote, but also the larger set of relations outside and beyond the frame, what Walter Benjamin might have meant as the contingency of the photograph. Photography, as Roland Barthes reminded us in Camera Lucida, has the capacity to make meaning meaningful and to animate us, its viewers, to draw us in. They, following Tina Camp, are deeply, quote, affective objects that implicate and leave impressions upon us through multiple forms of contact, end quote, such as through seeing, feeling, touching, and sound. This means, then, that scholars must engage nuances, silences, ellipses that haunt and linger in the photographic frame or at the edge of it. The evidence of things not photographed, and here I'm thinking eloquently of the rich essay by art historian Krista Thompson. Lastly, it has been well documented that photography bore an intimate relationship with death throughout the 19th century, not least of which is spirit photography. And the intimate relationship continues to this day. More specifically in this paper, I turn to photography as a way to think about the relationship between photography, death, and Black life by considering the work of Black photographer and conceptual artist Carrie Mae Weems. I want to pause here to make a really important note. One that gets carried further out in the book is that I am not using Weems' work as an example of the type of theoretical work that I'm trying to do here. In fact, I am arguing the opposite, that Weems is a theorist of Black life and Black death. And so the work is essential to the type of arguments that I'm making, but also I want to mark too, I'm moving against the grain of what happens in a lot of theoretical work where we draw in artistic works or photographic works as supplements. I'm trying to position this as central to the theoretical work that needs to happen. And in fact, I would argue that it is artists who are our greatest hope in trying to imagine a world than that which we currently live. And so I want to be very clear about how I'm positioning Carrie Mae Weems in this paper. My aim then is to read speculatively, to reveal traces of Black life that refuse complete obliteration, or Black life that insists on being, that insists on dwelling in and around us. To be clear, I'm interested in how Black people invest the dead with meaning, especially in our movements to defend the Black dead. Thus, I ask Ekwanishi Mbembe, how do we, whether through writing or other various creative practices, quote, bring back to life that which has been condemned to non-existence, or death for that matter? How do we carefully attend, I'm asking, to the domain of the insisting Black life, its refusal to leave? We are visually arrested by the erratic fog-like qualities of the image. Its appearance lingers over and around us, the two bodies occupying the center of the frame. The shadowy, even painterly effect appears to dawdle ever so languidly across the frame center, almost like a low-lying cloud that refuses to lift, reducing our visibility of what is in front of us and what is around us. In some ways, it reminds me of the evaporation fog that I encounter when I walk along Lake Michigan on an unseasonably warm morning in the winter months. The density of the fog obscures the landscape ahead, and as you move through it, it is as if it forms a halo around your body. If my use of the fog here reminds you of Walter Benjamin's opening line in A Small History of Photography, then you're right, that is my intention. The black, even bluish background of the image seems to be illumined by shadowy qualities of the image. That is, the fuzziness, or I would even say the lightness of it seems to paradoxically supply the light necessary for our seeing the rest of the image. These qualities in some ways indicate a type of dreamy or slow-moving stillness, not stillness in the way that it's used to describe, quote, lifelessness, quite the opposite actually. I'm referring to a stillness that gestures to a quiet moving, a movement of life. There's something along the lines of what Harvey Young refers to as, quote, the motion of stillness that appears in Thomas Zeiley's daguerreotypes. The arrest of time, we might say, following Benjamin, or the arrest of motion to Pace Muybridge. And as Kevin Quashie has reminded us, quiet can describe a presence and, at the same time, encompass fantastic motion. In this regard, the aesthetic movement of the shadowy stillness takes on a lively quality that gestures to an absent presence, a past, present, future, and in the case of Weems' image, an unbounded future that has yet to happen, but must and can be imagined. It is, indeed, what Tina Kemp outlines as a Black feminist grammar of futurity. If viewers are able to temporarily break through the visual density of the fog to hold in abeyance its hauntily eye-catching and even unsettling qualities, someone, indeed two Black bodies appear. We might even say disembodied bodies. They appear differently positioned in the frame. In the image on the left, the black body is facing forward. Something just happened, sorry. Can you all see my PowerPoint?
We're seeing the message you're sharing your screen.
Okay, that's weird. How about now?
Yes.
Okay. They appear differently positioned in the frame. In the image on the left, the Black body is facing forward. They are looking at us as we try to decipher their blurry face that is compounded by the viscosity of the shadow. Certainly, the blurriness, according to most accounts in theories of photography, forecloses the ability for the viewer to be pricked by the image. The force of the punctum fails, so to speak. The logic follows then that the illegibility or the ambiguity of the image pushes the viewers away because it denies them the ability to ascertain the final meaning of this image, or any image for that matter that is blurred out. In this account, blurred or out of focus images are often considered banal or in some cases just bad images. But I want to trouble this perspective. Rather than the blurriness of their face contributing to a disgruntled passivity, Weems' image and the technique of blurriness, precisely because of its ambiguity, invites a more imaginative and deeper engagement. In the image on the right, they are in profile. They do not look at the camera or the viewers at all. It is a visual refusal, a refusal of a passive engagement. For to really engage with and be engaged by these images, one will require more than a dependency on the ocular. It requires a series of sensory motors, reading practices, and a desire to imagine. They are wearing black hoodies. The light of the shadow illuminates the hoodie as well as the silver zipper that is noticeable in the image on the left. Though hard to make out, we can even see the drawstrings of the hooded portion of the hoodie dangle unevenly. They appear of medium build. The shoulders in the left image seems to have this ghostly glow to it, and the shoulders in the right image, or what we can make out of them, are dimmed. However, the source that provides the light on the left is hovering over the body on the right. Its haziness just lingers, a still lingering. Their arms hang along the torso and past the waist while their hands appear furrowed in a semi-open fist, almost like someone who is unsure of what to do with their hands. We cannot see the full body in either image. We are denied the privilege of complete ascription. And to be honest, I am not entirely inimical to this denial. In this total climate of darkness, to draw on art historian Darby English, the blurred light appears as a guide, an index of that which refuses total obliteration. The bluish haze of the images confounds and compels gesturing viewers to ask, what is going on? Who are these bodies? Why are they so out of focus? What of the body on the right? Why the blurriness? We are gripped by blurred uncertainty, or as Sean Michelle Smith would argue, brought to the edge of sight. The first of two sections of this paper. This image that I've just offered a reading of is from Carrie Mae Weems' All the Boys series from 2016, which considers the constant killing of young black men, women, and children by police officers and other white people who perpetuate anti-black violence and murder in the United States. The series mostly comprises photographically based archival pigment prints rendered in bluish griselle, portraying young African Americans wearing hoodies. On the one hand, attempts to memorialize black victims who never stood a chance against the state's boundedness to violence, and on the other hand, renders devastatingly visible how the brutal facts of evidence of their public murders are not, in fact, evidentiary at all. Weems, who is also known for a series of other works such as From Here I Saw What Happened and I Cried, the Louisiana Project, Roaming, and Grace Notes, Reflections for Now, just to name a few, visually compels viewers to, in rather disconcerting ways, confront and make sense of anti-black terror. It should be no surprise that this series is a critique of not only the state, its sanctioning and protecting of those who deploy racial violence, and the disproportionate policing and surveillance of black people. Reminiscent of Bertillonian arrest or photographs or mugshots, this photographic portrait uses a two-part composition, one side view, one front view. According to Alan Sekula, the, quote, profile view served to cancel the contingency of expression. The contour of the head remained consistent with time. The frontal view provided a face that was more likely to be recognizable, especially in search for a suspect. The background of these photos is stark and almost always simple. The aim here is to avoid distraction from the facial image of the photographed subject. Bertillon belabored the need for, quote, a standard focal length, even in consistent lighting, and a fixed distance between the camera and the unwilling sitter, end quote. As Tina Camp notes, in these photographic encounters, quote, the camera was an instrumental tool brought to bear on the body to produce images with the exceptional legal status of the visual documents that furnished irrefutable evidence of what came to be defined as a criminal body, end quote. As a repressive genre, it sought to reduce the humanity from subjects before the camera, especially in the case of Black people. Indeed, if, as Ariella Azule argues, that, quote, the shutter is the synecdoche for the operation of photography's imperial enterprise, and of course imperial violence, then the black subject was never meant to survive the camera's shutter. Images such as arrest mugshots and Bertollone's desire for them to maintain an aesthetically neutral standard of representation had major consequences for black people. Writing about reform photographs with its similar relationship to the optics of visibility and surveillance, Sadia Hartman writes that these photographs, quote, coerced black people into visibility as a condition of policing and charity, making those bound to appear, here she's drawing on Huey Copeland's work, suffer the burden of representation, end quote. And others, the rendering of black person as the stand-in for historical, legal, and social narratives of black subject as one bound to criminality. So in other words, this was the bounding of blackness or the black subject to a criminal identity. The mugshot, so to speak, proffered the visual and ergo evidentiary proof of said criminality. For Bertillon, writes Sekula, quote, the mastery of the criminal body necessitated a massive campaign of inscription, a transformation of the body's sign into a text, end quote, a shorthand. Thus, to paste Jacqueline Goldsby, blackness plus criminality as criminality was sedimented as the cultural logic that organized modernity. Weems' images challenge this evidentiary function. They upend, albeit for just a few photographic seconds, the function of arrest photographs to clearly and simply capture the criminal subject. Blurriness in Weems' images hastens the intrusion of the state by delimiting the primary biopolitical function of the arrest photograph. It blurs the body for which the state seeks to capture in its frame, making its apprehension fugitive. It vanishes into the mist of the fog. I want to pause here to state, I am not offering a reading that suggests that Black people are always able to escape the capture of state or anti-Black violence and death. Rather, what I am suggesting is that this is one such possibility that I believe the visual poetics of Weems' interruptive and an imaginative aesthetic work opens up. It is a Black feminist insistence on and a demand for and an invitation to engage in a reading practice that seeks out and is attentive to, quote, alternative modes, alternative strategies, and alternative ways of life that exist in the shadows of anti-Black violence and in the ghostly landscapes of Black death. In The Engine of Visualization, Thinking Through Photography, Patrick Menard argues that from an early conception of photography, photographs were frequently, quote, thought about in connection with shadows, end quote. Accordingly, different kinds of shadowing, shadow playing and shadow puppetry, and visual culture provided different kinds of depictions depending on their projection and how the light source, usually very minimal, was cast. Often the aesthetic work of the shadow sought to detect things that cast them, and at other times, the use of the shadow aimed to confound the final meaning of an image. In the former, a shadow can be understood as that which is the depiction of an imagined depiction of a substance, or the outline of the subject or object that cast it. In the latter, the technique of using shadow in the production of images may be to reveal an absence presence. It is an aesthetic move that is meant to draw on an imaginative seeing. The latter technique of using shadow is of interest to me. Indeed, as Eric Mortensen notes, this method of shadowing creates ambiguity that in turn catapults the viewer towards novel interpretations of faces and bodies that are in various degrees of disintegration. The ambiguity stems from the fact that shadows can take on a visual life. And here I'm trying to sort of scaffold and build the lively part of this argument. They may appear still or in perpetual flux. They flicker, move across surfaces, deepen or darken, and they can be solid or amorphous. Shadows haunt. Here we would do well to remember that, as A.V. Gordon remarked, being haunted moves beyond, quote, cognitive doubt or of the unknown, but gestures to a state of something else, end quote. It represents or it connotes, to use the language of the photograph, quote, a structure of feeling, end quote. What appears in the shadows, then brooding, can also be understood as that which announces itself. Phrased otherwise, what announces itself as an absence or lurks in the shadows, I'm wagering here to stay with Gordon a little longer, also then announces itself as a seething presence. Thus, instead of reading the shadow technique as one of obscuring, it might be more provocative to think of it as describing, or more even, an invitation for the viewer to separate light from dark, to distinguish between absence, presence, to see and read their own figures. The point here is that there is no finite reading of the socio-aesthetic work of the shadow, and the out of focus and blurred faces in Weems' photos certainly do not lend well to a determined reading. In fact, her use of a combination of techniques opened the doors to a myriad of interpretations, not least because, quote, the dialectics of visibility and invisibility involves a constant negotiation between what can be seen and what is in the shadows. In the remaining pages, then, I want to gesture to two possible ones. In the image, Weems makes no attempt to create some false illusion about the intimate hold of Black Death by retreating to photography. She is, in fact, dwelling so close to death that if it desired, it could reach out from the photographic plate and look into her capturing eyes. Indeed, as Peggy Phelan has argued, the event of death has always already occurred for photography. More, the context for which the series was created is bound up in extreme anti-Blackness and the deathly remains that is left in the wake. She has made clear that the images in this series are intimately dealing with the question of Black Death. There is no question about that. If you were to look at some of the interviews, gallery talks, that is quite clear. The series is in an attempt to not just memorialize, as she has stated, but to try to grapple with the affective and visual impact of such constancy, the everydayness of Black Death, so to speak. In this regard, I believe to look at Weems' photographs, especially in this series, is to be unsettled. In the same way that death is unsettling, so too are photographs of and about our intimate inhabitation with it. By unsettled, I mean to suggest a displacement from the routinized practices of mourning that seems to follow after Black Death. That is to say, we have a vigil, we honor those who died, we can think of roadside memorials here, and then we carry on with our daily lives, right? That vigil has passed, the death is marked, right? And I want to mark that as problematic, for various reasons. But this is what I mean by sort of getting us to really engage with the Black Death, not in a normalized practice of how we have always done it. Then to look at Weems' images is to, on the one hand, be beckoned to bear witness, but as she says, quote, bearing witness means something more vital here. And so on the other hand, it means that we are willing to be moved and affected by the impressions left on us by our sustained visual engagement with death. And here I'm thinking too of looking at, video footage of last breaths of people who lost their lives, right? Of the watching of Black Death and what that does to how we sort of engage, but also what that does to one's psyche. What does it mean to hold on to that Black life? What does it mean to sort of repeat, I can't breathe, right? That is this desire to hold on to that which existed. This engagement with the image is one of profound dwelling. It is something along the lines of what Derrida gets at when writing about being towards death of the image, or to avoid confusion with Heidegger, quote, the being to death of an image, which has a force to compel us to exist in death. What I'm suggesting above and arguing for here is how a reading of her image requires us to dwell with the dead, in the frame of death, to exist in the uncomfortable intimacy of the visual landscape of death. The blurriness of these images affords us no ability to apprehend whether or not the subjects of these photographs are actually dead. which is why they are so compelling to me. But this shadowy ambiguity does not foreclose such a reading either. In its place is the aura of death, the thought of death, the facticity of death, or how I have invested the dead in this image in order to render meaning to it and from it, to defend it in my reading. What is at play here is the socioaesthetic work of the shadow and the work of the dead as it entangles us and our engagement. My argument thus is not that these images can fully convey the reality of death, lest we risk an overdetermined reading, but that they can and do compellingly approximate it. The aesthetic of the shadow then performs a type of work in our viewing. It forces viewers to confront the dead that has been. Its animating force has lured us into the frame to be addressed by the dead. The blind field, so to speak, that Barth gestured to and that Avery Gordon expanded on. In effect, this intimate interplay of presence and absence that is provoked by the ghostly substance that lingers around the body implicates the viewers, forcing an introspective consideration of that which is being represented or approximated. Ultimately, if, as Barth observes, that the punctum is the medium by which photograph comes alive, and if, just if, as Jean-Michel Swift notes, quote, the punctum is a trace that launches Barth beyond that has been of photography, beyond the photograph's referential denotation, beyond what can be seen, and into his own memory and experience, end quote, might the prick induced by the blur here comparably send us into and beyond the what could be. Here we might ask, what if the blurry or shadowy qualities represent the light leaving the body, or better yet, life leaving the blurred body but not completely vanishing? The blurry matter of life, the hums and the debris of anti-Black violence, refuse to give up and insist on existing. My point, the aesthetic of the shadow indexes the ways in which life exceeds the totalizing nature of violence and death. So Weems' images not only places us in relation to death, but they, I am claiming, invoke and evoke the impulse to locate ourselves within the imagistic space, what I call landscapes of death and other work. They convoke, if you will, a visual space where the living and the dead convene. The power of Weems' image lies then precisely in its haziness, because it disrupts the visual habitus to turn away from images of death and to do our best to not see them. After all, she did say that looking at these images require a vital bearing witness, which could also be interpreted as a dynamic, lively, or an animated engagement with the Black dead. Section 2. If we are willing to inhabit the visual space of death, what I've been calling landscapes of death, what might be revealed? Who or what might we encounter in our Black ungeographic convening? What lives might be animated by our recourse to dwell with and alongside them? Indeed, what might our ocular senses in the dwelling spaces of the visual frame and beyond allow us to see of the Black dead? But importantly, what sonic, haptic, and affective experiences are required of us in this convening with the Black dead? What of the social life of the Black dead? So these are all a series of questions that in some ways I'm constantly trying to grapple with, whether here in this paper, but in the larger book project, of like what it truly means to dwell with the dead. Returning to Gordon, how do we conjure up the social life of the Black dead? And writing about conjuring, Gordon writes, is a particular form of calling up and calling out the forces that make things what they are in order to fix and transform a troubling situation. As a mode of apprehension and reformation, conjuring merges the analytical, the procedural, the imaginative, and the effervescent. But we have more to learn about how to conjure in an evocative and compelling way. And so here I read Gordon as really gesturing towards what it means to craft a method of conjuring up the Black dead. If we accept this definition by Gordon, which I do, I want to carry forth the argument that in this work, Weems evocatively and compellingly conjures up the constitutive feature of Black death, Black social life. Indeed, she brings life for us to see. Indeed, she brings to life for us to see, even if imaginatively, that which has been loitering in the shadows the entire time. It was always there. Like, again, Black life is always in the shadows or next to Black death. In her second image, Weems is unrelenting in her demand for an active and imaginative engagement. While looking at these images, while looking at this image, imagine that you have broken through the dense fog and that you have regained some aspects of your visual senses. You might notice that some of the qualities that were hard to see along your visual and spatial journey into the frame, so to speak, have become slightly clearer, but not completely. The bluish, shadowy haze that moved across and lingered around the body has somewhat vanished, but not entirely. If we look closely in the frame on the right, we can see some of the blurriness linger at the bottom, working its way up faintly to surround both of the arms. In the left image, the faintness of the shadowy substance hover around the body, especially from behind, and we see it loiter along the right edge of the frame. It too is seething out of the frame. It insists on remaining and resists containment. The darkness of the background seems to be more pronounced, the shadowy presence manifests in a rather deep darkened blue. In fact, upon another look, it appears as if the darkness and the commingling of the deep blue has both darkened the light that we noticed in the first image and lightened the darkness in this image. In the clearing, we can mark other noticeable differences. The person is wearing a hoodie like the last image, but this time they are wearing a leather coat on top of it. Their hands are nestled in their pockets. Perhaps in this visual landscape of death, the temperature is a bit colder. We can see the white drawstrings of the hoodie, but it's not clear if the hoodie is black or gray. It is up to interpretation. We can see the unevenness of the zipper's stitching and the construction, probably from multiple washes and drying. It covers their head to add an extra layer of warmth since they are already wearing a baseball cap, which appears to be black from the image on the left, but based on the image on the right, it could also be white or gray. Like the first image, they are wearing black pants, but they can also be casual joggers. Again, we are left in ambiguity and allowed to construct our own descriptive interpretations of this image. Despite these noticeable physical and other aesthetic distinctions, what remains the same is our inability to fully make out the face of the person. Is it Ayanna Jones, Sandra Bland, Requiem Boyd, Erica Gardner, or any number of Black women among the Black dead? But that's just it. We continue to look, see, witness, and insist on looking again and again and again because we want to hold on to life. We want to invest it with everlasting meaning and with constant breath. We want to keep breath. Weems continues to use blurriness as a technique to keep hold of the viewers, to keep us locked into a blurred intimacy with the image, which propels a speculative reading, and one that I have tried to do here. Readings that might allow us to imaginatively proclaim, as Lucille Clifton does in the last lines of her Untitled poem, "Come celebrate with me that every day something has tried to kill me and has failed." And their attempt to memorialize, which, as I have argued a la Derrida, is also always a practice of mourning, which is always about localizing the dead. Weems' images remind us of the necessary work of attending to the dead despite our fears and anxieties of death. And this wake work, to draw on Christina Sharp, a practice of caring for the dead, what is revealed is our desire to animate the ground of the dead. And our convening with the dead, which might be in a bus stop where, and my larger book project, I go to an actual site where a young Black man was stabbed to death by a white person at the University of Maryland's campus, to think about the ways in which mourners created a space to hold on to that sort of Black life. In the living room where Ayanna Jones was killed, in or near the jail cell where Sandra Bland died, outside the complex where T.T. Dangerfield was murdered, we've struggled to inhabit the space of the dead so that we might animate their life, but also be haptically and affectively roused by their presence, even if or because of our imaginative investments of how the dead dwell in and around us. Imagination here implies an injunction, a forceful impulse to construct and interpret imagination that insists that the viewer put together various inventive tools of landscaping. And so here I go back to my concept of landscape in order to cultivate and repurpose landscapes of death so that these spaces might be revitalized with life, with Black life. Likewise, Weems' series provide a space and time to think, dwell, envision, inhabit, and be in Black life otherwise. The images as we navigate the foggy conditions allow us to imagine and see Black life in a different space and time. It should be clear by now from my readings of them at least that Weems' images are a demand that we grapple with death and the dead itself as an object worth our attention. If we are willing to accept this visual proposition, we allow ourselves to be enraptured in a blurred intimacy with the images, her images, get a glimpse of, a touch of, a feeling by the ghostly presence of the dead, or as A.V. Gordon writes, how the dead, quote, hang around the living, chatter, sing, loiter. In this manner, the image's ambiguity then gestures to how even in the event of death, there are always traces of life's attempt to leave residues and to create despite our certain vanishing. Against the grain of the documentary and photography, which is imbued with the authoritative truth and certainty, Weems' use of the blur infuses tensions to perturb the certainties of the image. In so doing, she unseals the edges of the frame to invite viewers to construct their own personal interpretations and, more importantly, conceive of other possibilities, possible readings, possible life. In the context of these images, the blur serves as a site of possibility and as an invitation to read archives of violence and death adjacent to life. Black life beyond the present. Finally, what I mean here is that for Weems, what counts as Black life cannot be answered in the here and the now, and that we can only imagine the answers to this query if we are willing to also take flight into the abyss of the fog, the unknown, into the blurred frame. While we live in a world where Black death is the condition of Black life does not collapse in the hold of Black death. Again, to draw on Christina Sharp, it becomes lively. Lively in the sense that it continues to animate the condition of being. It continues to insist its refusal by the state apparatus. Poet Dennis Smith gets at this liveliness in one of his poems in his collection, Don't Call Us Dead. It is not a death sentence anymore. It's not death anymore. It's more. It's a sentence. A sentence. In this moving and syntactically visual poem, Smith refuses death. In each rewriting of death sentence, the totality and overwhelming structure of death loses its grammatical footing. It is omitted in each rewriting. Perhaps the death sentence could not eradicate the insistence of life, or maybe life found a way to inhabit the sentences of death. Returning to Weems, then, I maintain that in the same way that the bluish haze in the images above lingers around the body, so too does life loiter the Black dead, beckoning us to convene with them, to simply be with them. What I have tried to do here, following Hartman in her reading of reform images of Black women and girls, is, quote, discern the glimmer of possibility, feel the ache of what it might be, end quote. We must continue to construct a reading practice that enables us to read for, quote, the wanderings of Black life and death, the lively dead here, and wandering, I'm thinking very much of Sarah Jane Cervenak's work. Finally, it is this Black insistence of imagination, then, that allows one to see what cannot be seen anymore in the physical place of anti-Blackness. It is to make lively the Black dead. We cannot afford to not defend the dead. We must, with all that we have, continue to insist their life, even in the shadows of a climate of sheer and sweeping anti-Black destruction, and in a landscape where Black life is assumed to not exist. There is so much life. What I have tried to point to here is what it means to maintain a reading practice that reveals forms of Black shadow life, that which refuses complete obliteration, refuses to take its final breath, refuses to cede space to whiteness, racism, and violence, that which insists on remaining vitally sentient, remaining, remaining, breathing, breathing. Thank you.
Thank you, LaCharles, for a remarkably eloquent and powerful presentation. I want to suggest that everybody, any questions that come up, if you could put them into the chat box, and then we'll read them aloud, and LaCharles will get a chance to elaborate on what he shared so far. First question up is from Monroe Price. I wonder if you would cast light on Weems' work by comparing it at some level to other Black artists like Kara Walker and Carrie James Marshall, or is it more appropriate to compare her work as you do to the Lynching Museum in Montgomery?
Thank you, Monroe Price, for that question. I think there's a few ways that one could answer that question. So I'll say this. And all the work that I do as both a visual and cultural historian, I try to locate it with a larger sort of visual history, a larger social history, and in this case, a larger sort of artistic practices, right? A Black artistic practice. And so to get at the first half of your question of comparing it to someone like the levels of Kara Walker and Carrie James Marshall's, I would argue that they exist in that genealogy. I avoid sort of comparative tones because it oftentimes add values to one artist over the other. But what I will suggest is that Weems exists within that genealogy, but each of those artists are doing different types of work. They're attending to different forms of Black life. They're also, of course, working in very different mediums. But they're all at the core using their creative practices to expand how we think about Blackness and Black life. In that regard, I would locate Weems within a genealogy of Kara Walker, Carrie James Marshall, but I would also, and this is as someone who writes mostly about photography, I would more locate Weems' work within a genealogy of someone like Roy D. Carava, Daoud Bey. These are artists that I would sort of locate that work in. I mean, there's a whole host of other artists that I would sort of locate Weems' work. On the question about lynching and the Lynching Museum in Montgomery, I locate the type of work that Weems is doing within the larger history of what it means to visualize or try to image forms of grotesque anti-Black violence. I would suspect, and based on some of the research I've done, Weems, of course, is very aware of not only lynching, but also lynching photographs and the ways in which they circulated. Weems is also aware of the ways in which not to speak for Weems, but to understand the gravity of her work, is also aware of how Black people reshape the conversations around lynching photographs by recirculating the images to do a different type of visual work. And in that regard, I will locate Weems' work as being within that genealogy, but not neatly, I would say.
Next question is from Kanisha Sherelle Persard. Thank you so much, LaCharles. Do you understand this dwelling with the dead or dwelling with death as a corrective to the libidinal economy of anti-Blackness?
Thanks first, Kanisha, for joining, and thank you for that question. So I don't. The short answer is that I and as you probably know, I've been reading a little bit, actually a lot more now that I have more time on my hands, about where I'm trying to place within a larger sort of theoretical and even I would say archival and methodological sort of history, this idea of dwelling with the dead. That is, in fact, what I'm trying to think through in the book project. And so I don't really have a fully formed answer to the question. But what I will say um, is that my my intuitive response would be that I am trying to think alongside the kind of literature around the libidinal economy. I'm not so sure I've landed on it being a corrective to it. And so, in that regard, I'm still trying to figure out where I want to place Dwelling with the Dead. And of course, how I got to dwelling, of course, in some ways, it's because when I encountered the bus stop, for example, um, I was struck by how how well the space had been tended to by mourners, right? That is every day there was a new set of flowers there, right? So as you would like, and so I'm trying to think of like in that regard, what does it mean to then dwell in the space, physical space, and then now how do we dwell in an imagistic space? And so I'm really trying to play with that, and I guess you know another way to not ramble so much to that response because it's something I've been thinking about is to say that I wonder if I'm trying to sort of take a route around this idea of the libidinal economy to think something else um, about it or to think against its grain. So, I mean, I'll pause there, but it is something I've been struggling with, not least because I'm also trying to work through the literature around even psychoanalysis and trying to really think through some of the literature that I didn't anticipate to find its way into the project, I guess.
Question from Sarah Jackson. LaCharles, I would love to know how your work intersects with Ruha Benjamin's concept of the Black afterlife and how she centers the ongoing symbolic and visual life, even of the dead, in public narrative and culture.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, Sarah. And the honest answer is that when I was working on this project and this paper, I hadn't read in a way that I feel like I needed to Ruha Benjamin's work on Black afterlife. And I will say though, having skimmed it, that I do find a lot of similarities with the concept of Black afterlife. Of course, as I said in the opening part of my talk, that this discussion around the Black dead or this discussion around the Black afterlife or thinking about the dead isn't really new, and that there's a great literature that exists there that I would argue, I mean, people like Courtney Baker have tapped into it, but like a lot of folks haven't really returned back to Black death, and so I think the concept like Black afterlife, I would imagine that my own concept of Black shadowed life find itself within a similar sort of genealogy of thinking. What I will say that if I wonder if my sort of use of, for example, dwelling with the dead, or in this case, Black shadow life or the lively dead. Um, I'm just trying to make sure that I'm on point with the question. Is an attempt to sort of get at how the public is discussing Black life and Black death, but also how Black visual artists are creating a new way of seeing the representation of the Black dead, right? And so, in that regard, do I want to quickly say that Carrie Mae Weems is engaged in this sort of practice of the Black afterlife? I'm not there yet, and not because I don't think that she is, but that I'm still trying to work through some of these large ideas.
Monroe Price is back again. Maybe my question is how museums have treated Weems. How have they translated her, contextualized her? I'm also thinking of Christian art and the importance of death and the narrative role of art in Weems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, So that's a very interesting question, Monroe, and one because there is a huge conversation of the ways in which Black artists have been treated by museums, and many of them have not been treated fondly, right? So that's on the table, um, in terms of much of Weems' work, it has received a lot of museum attention. That is for certain. I think this particular series that I've been writing about hasn't really traveled through the museum spaces as much as, for example, her work of From Here I Saw What Happened and I Cried, Roman Project, the Louisiana Project. Um, my 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 sort of critical academic eye is that I'm not so sure museums quite know what to do with this work as it stands now, this particular body of work, because it marks a turn in Weems' work where she actually engages more contemporary questions such as anti-black violence, and where she uses different mediums than just photography, right? In this work. So there's also, in an article that I published, I engage in the video installation of that's a part of the series. But there's also a series of other images that that's a part of this series that, based on some of the responses of when this was at an exhibit in Louisiana at the Louisiana State University's museum, it was a sense that even the audience didn't quite know how to place that work. And so in that regard, I'm not so certain most museums have figured out a way to locate this particular body of Weems' work into the museum space. And I would also add too, and to the question of how they translated it, it wasn't until she really laid out, that this work is about thinking about state-sanctioned violence, they realized, oh, it's responding to moments like Ferguson moment, Baltimore, all of the, but that was always clear from the work. And so I've always struggled, particularly now, of like why museums needed Weems to articulate what the work was doing in order for them to translate it into why it mattered for the museum. There's a case in point in the video installation. Weems uses the video of the Philando Castile's killing. And there was one debate that happened, and I think it may have been at a university in South Dakota, where they were not sure if they should show those parts of the video installation because they didn't know if it would trigger a type of response. So triggered a type of response in a way that the Rodney King video did. Sorry, I realized I left off that thought. And so I think the struggle is with the content of it. It's not, but Weems' content has never really been neat. I mean, when you think about the ways in which she recast the daguerreotypes, the photographs and magazines, right, to rewrite a narrative of Black life, I mean, they were never really easily translatable, I guess, is the response. There's one other, and on the point of Christian art, I haven't really thought too much about Christian art in that regard. I have thought about the notion of death and Christianity. That I have, but not its relationship to Christian art.
A question from C.C. McKee. Thank you for this rich reading of Weems' recent work. Your comment on psychoanalysis anticipates my question and comment. In his seminar on Antigone, Lacan develops his concept of being between two deaths, one symbolic, one actual. This, of course, has powerful resonances with Patterson's theorization of social death and Butler's reinterpretation of Lacan. How does the grammar of the blur that you develop in this presentation relate to the in-betweenness or interstitiality of death, the Black anthologies?
Cece, thank you so much for the question. Again, it anticipated this question. And as you know, and as I mentioned to you before, that the question of blur took me off my feet. I had in my work, I had no anticipation on dealing with like the blur as a concept to think about Black life, but it was precisely because it lent well to this idea of an in-betweenness, and which is why in this paper I do presence, absence, past, present, future. Like I do all of these sort of to sort of connote the ways in which the blur have functioned as a sort of a pendulum that just stays in the middle, right? It's allowing me to make certain types of arguments about Black death, but also certain types of arguments about the ontology of Blackness, the ontology of Black life. And so, in some ways, I'm having to remember my grad class on Lacan. And in some ways, um, you know, I don't necessarily go the Butler reinterpretation of Lacan. I go back to Lacan, not because I think Lacan is the best voice for thinking about sort of Black life and Black death, but because um, Lacan opens up in a conceptual space, I think, and as you say, the grammar of the blur, to sort of think about both um, the limitations of the blur and trying to organize and imagine Black life, but also the vast possibilities of the blur. Again, gesturing back to Ivy Wilson's concept of how he uses the shadow, of trying to think about Black subjectivity, Black ontology that is in excess of the ways in which we think about the physical nature of life, and the physical nature of death, right? That I'm trying to sort of occupy this in between space, this space of excess, to say in some ways that we don't need to be able to see or recognize that that is actual Black death to begin to imagine the sociology of Black life, right? And so and in that way, at least right now, I like what the blur is allowing me to do in terms of thinking about Black life. I hope that like gets just a little of your question, and I know that there's more that I could have said about that, given because I know you. So
From Zane Osteen, thank you, LaCharles, for the amazing talk. Knowing your interest in the law as well, I was wondering if you would like to comment on the forensic side of all of the images of the dead, and maybe I should say the forensic aesthetic that may contribute the perceived realness of the death in contrast to the death as a media event.
yeah, Zeno, thank you for the question, and that is it's a really good question, and as many of the people who are in this talk know, and as you know, Zeno, um, I'm very committed to thinking about the question of evidence, and even this sort of even though there's not a lot of discussion of evidence in this particular paper, what I should say is that in my larger book project, this is what I categorize as Weems evidencing Black life, right? So I argue that Weems sort of reframe and reorganizes John Berger's way of seeing. I'm in fact arguing that she presents a new form, a new mode of thinking about visual evidence. So just want to say how this paper fits into the larger one. But to get back to your question about the forensic side of all these images is they're there because that's exactly why I went to talk about Bertolone, because many of the images and many of the images in this series, there's another one that I have not presented on before and that I'm holding dear to my heart. It's the opening of my dissertation introduction chapter, but it is an image that completely destroys Bertolone's descriptive categorizing of the subject and then the images, right? So in some ways, Weems is also very much challenging this dependency on visual proof and evidentiary proof, and in fact arguing that, sorry, I'm arguing that Weems, in fact, uses the work to challenge our dependency on sort of the fact that what we have, so that is, say, visual images of Black death, serve as evidence to or for law, right? So essentially what I'm saying is that even though we believe, I think maybe not us, but most people believe that if the images exist as evidence of the killings of Black people, then why aren't they serving as evidence and then in the court, right? I mean, that's one argument that's made. But what I read Weems as doing is saying that why have we depended so much on the law to accept that which we have in front of us to consider it as evidentiary of what is actually happening? So how then do we reread these images as evidence, but not as evidence of evidentiary proof within the legal sense, not as photographic truth, not as forensic truth, not as some sort of measurement of, in a forensic sense, some measurement of the image capturing that which it needs to capture in order for it to serve as evidentiary proof. And so, and I guess, you know, to sort of bring that back down to this specific paper and the forensic aesthetic that you just gestured to, which I actually really like that term. I haven't thought about the forensic aesthetic, is that she is in fact trying to unpack this dependency on the forensics and to trouble it as a normalizing discourse, right? Like, how do we rethink these various forms of discourses that have produced or created a framework of how we see different types of images, whether those are photographic images or video images. And one really good example of that is the ways in which the Rodney King video was reused in the courtroom, right? What we thought we saw in that video was completely restructured to be something else, right? And so, I mean, I'll pause there. I like talking about visual evidence. I'm happy to talk more about it. And one paper that I'm working on is called Insistent Evidence Otherwise, really trying to unpack what we've come to sort of associate with evidence itself.
A question from Sam Teckle. Thank you, LaCharles, for such a generative talk. I am interested in the image of the bus shelter as makeshift urban memorialization that marks both the death but also Black lives that were so often already disregarded. In effect, I've read these memorials as both marking death but recalling disregarded Black life. Could you say more about the role these kinds of urban memorials play in your larger project? Also, check out Sandra Brewster's project Blur. It might be helpful for you to think with.
Thank you so much, Sam, and yes to Sandra Brewster's Blur. So yes, I'm actually happy you asked the question about the bus stop, because in many ways the bus stop was an important changing point. As we know in dissertations, there's changes happen throughout the writing process. We encounter things that we didn't anticipate, and then we then realize that's a really important. It fundamentally shifts the argument that you're trying to make, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So the bus stop here, then, I would argue that the bus stop functioned more as a space for, in this case, for Black people to hold on to the life of the person who was killed than to create it as a site of memorialization or remembrance. And I want to say why I'm saying that. This was a bus stop on the campus of the University of Maryland. Someone was stabbed to death there. The university allowed the students to do whatever sort of memorialization they wanted for over the next 24 hours to 48 hours, maybe up to a week. But at some level, the university is like, well, this is a bus stop, so we're gonna open it back up so that people can actually use it as the bus stop to get on and off the bus. And then the students, predominantly mostly Black students, were not happy with that decision. In fact, they believed that it was a disrespect to what had happened there. But they also believed that it was the university's desire to sort of cover up the ways in which death, particularly Black death, had happened across the United States at the time. And so what these students did, they fought and protested the university to create this as a actual site of memory of the person who was killed than as a bus stop, right? So it became less of, at first, the desire to create some sort of visual, they wanted to remember Lieutenant Colonel, but they did not want to remember him for only a day or 2 days or 3 days, right? That they, in fact, they wanted to make sure that his life was sort of, and this is where I sort of get to the concept of dwelling, that made sure that his life respectfully and properly dwelled in that space, right? The remains of his life there. So what they did, they added photographs of him. They added information about how he did in school, information about his life. They added flowers. They added red tape so that people can use it. So they began to do all of these forms of landscaping of a space, right, in order to suggest that even though he's physically not there anymore, his life is still there, right? And so in some ways, to get then back to the question of Black life already described, it was their way to say, we will not allow you to disregard the Black life that had been taken here. And so we want to create a long-term sort of, I don't like the word monument. I don't like the word, monument. I'll just say that they wanted to create a site where Black life was allowed to thrive in its own way, not at the doing of the university. And so if you Google University of Maryland's bus stop in Death, you'll see the site. And then the argument that I make in like the second paper is that in fact the dwelling, it wasn't just Lieutenant Colonel. This is really hard. Sorry, this is really hard for me to talk about because it's such an when you listen to the students, you realize, wow, this was really a tragic event. That it's because that's how Lieutenant Colonel is being allowed to dwell in them. That's how they're able to hold on to his life, right? Being able to walk by that site and see that someone is tending to that site means that they're able to hold on to his life, right? And so I'm really trying to both play with the physical nature of what it means to dwell, but also what it might mean for the dead to dwell in us as we sort of create these different memorial sites. And so I hope that answers the question a little bit about the urban memorials.
A question from Jay. Thanks for your paper. I'm curious about your use of the term insistence in the sense of Black life insisted from death. What actually is insistence beyond an expression of will or desire, and what work does it do in this analysis?
Thank you for the question. I think that's a really great question, actually. So my use of insistence is primarily in my attempt to sort of think along terms such as refusal, right? But insistence here really came out of a comment that Sandra Bland's mom made a few years ago after she lost her daughter, and she said that I will continue to insist on the mattering of Sandra Bland's life. I will continue to insist that her story be heard, right? And so really my use of insistence is really an attempt to pay homage to the ways in which particularly Black mothers and Black people have insisted on making sure that the lives of the people whom they love continue to have relevance, continue to matter. And so my insistence here is a way to think about how Black life is insisted upon us to remember them, right? That the ways in which Black life insists on remaining even in the face of death. And it's really a way to mark, for me, like how we might begin to think about Black life having its own ontology, right? Like not physical life, but how it might exist in and around us, and how it may nudge us, insist us to remember it and to name it and to hold it. It follows a long line of Black feminist works such as even Christina Sharp and others to develop concepts beyond, as you say, sort of an expression or desire or will, but something else to name what might be happening, I guess is my way of doing it. And in the larger project, I actually try to develop a genealogy of insistence so that it's clear that this is not something that came out of the blue, but that I'm trying to locate it within a larger sort of history of Black people insisting or making a way, making do, and a whole host of different sort of concepts to describe what it means to hold on to Black life.
A comment from Sarah Jackson. Just really appreciate the clear care with which you are not only treating your larger subject matter here, but also the scholars and artists whose work you are drawing from.
Thank you, sir. I really appreciate that. It means that means a lot, but also citations is politics, it's an ethics, and for me, it's important to mark those who I'm in deep conversation with, because without that, this work is not possible.
So I'm going to ask a question.
Yes.
Getting back to what C.C. McKee called the grammar of the blur,
Yeah.
um, I love your treatment of the blur. I love the kind of contoured way in which you're kind of trying to unpack exactly what we recognize as blur, right? When it actually involves so many practices. My question has to do with the connection between blur and its invitation to imagine and the finality of death, right?
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
I guess I want you to unpack a little bit the violence that's connected to the death, because I think that death is very finite. It's
Yeah,
one moment,
absolutely.
right?
Yeah. Hmm.
And yet the blur invites us to see things in exactly the opposite way. So how much does violence actually act as a necessary, and I don't mean that in the way not necessary, but as a kind of constituent piece of death being recognized through blurring?
That's a great question, and I want to be, and and it may have not come across here. Um, I am not arguing that blur can suspend violence. It is existent alongside the violence of death. I want to be very clear about that. Even though I find potentiality in the blur to do other types of work, um, it cannot escape the violence and the finality of death, and that's why I try to gesture like it. I'm not saying that it somehow escapes death, that sometimes it somehow escapes violence, that it suspends, it prevents, but that can we think of the blur as existing alongside and in the same space as the violence that is signaled by death. So when I think of right, I guess another way to really draw in the blur is to come back to the shadow. And that's why I try to hold those two, even though they may seem at tension or at odds, I'm holding those there on purpose. The purpose is this. I'm trying to say that the blurred life or that black life that exists in the shadow not just exists in the shadows of death, but exists also in the shadows, which means that it's right next to, it's right behind, it may be in front of the violence that mark the very death of the subject, right? And so, and in some ways, I'm trying to say that you you can't have you cannot have the blurred black life without the grotesqueness of the violence that imposed and impacted upon the subject, which has now killed the subject, right? And so for me, they're in tandem. And oftentimes in my writing, in uneasy ways, it's hard to reconcile, especially in one of my chapters when I'm deeply reading the violence of Lieutenant Colonel's death, the stabbing, right? The running blood to the sidewalk. When I try to describe the violence that death came with, and then at the same time and same breath say, but let's hold on to his life, right? The It's so hard to reconcile those two arguments, and so in some ways, I don't think I'm trying to make the opposite argument. I'm trying to say, is it possible? I'm asking, is it possible through my readings to hold on to both of those? In the same way that I'm arguing that Black life cannot exist without Black death and Black death cannot exist without Black life, I'm also arguing that all of these formations cannot escape the violence which precipitated them. The reason why I'm trying to think about Black social life and Black shadow life, blurry life, is because I want to think about something that cannot be contained by Black death and its violence. But that doesn't mean that I'm trying to think out of it, away from it, to ignore it. That it's constantly there, and at any moment it can swoop down and wreak havoc again, right? Which is why I said, how do we think about this and the hums and debris of violence, right? Like imagine a war zone site where you go through the rebel and you're trying to find traces of life. I'm trying to think about how do we go to these sites and try to find the traces of the life that were sort of destroyed through violence.
Are there any other questions? I'll ask another one. I don't remember when it was, but the New York Times Style magazine did a pretty extensive profile of Carrie Mae Weems, which I'm imagining you saw, and it was detailed, it was biographical, it was very engaging with certain art installations. The thing that I ask you is that it called her, both in the headline and in the body of the piece, perhaps the best contemporary photographer. And it never explained the word perhaps. And I remember the tension that I felt, expecting that there was going to be some kind of contextualization of her work against a larger group of artists and photographers who somehow spoke to similar tensions, and there never was. And I just wonder if you'd comment on
that. You have me comment on New York Times Magazine. Barbie, I don't know that I don't know, how do I say this in a way that like is, I don't trust when major outlets, even like the New York Times Magazine, write about Black artists, right? Like even the use of perhaps, right, is troubling because it suggests that like, well, we have other people in mind who probably are the greatest contemporary artists, and they're probably not Black women, and they're probably not Black artists. And so I get exactly why you're asking me to comment on it, not to but like I struggle with that because they are writing a take on an artist, right? I'm trying to locate this artist rigorously within a body of work, right? That is doing more than a take on American life or Black life, right? And for me, I know exactly which piece you're talking about. I know the contents of the piece. And for me, I struggled with even the desire to like, I don't know, like, why write this sentence, perhaps the best contemporary artist? And why, right? As opposed to take what she has offered as profound contemporary artwork. Full stop. And this is not just this is not just New York Times Magazine. I think The Guardian has done similar things. Lots of the LA Times have done lots of that. And I struggle with that because no one's going to say Van Gogh was perhaps no, Van Gogh was the greatest, and so for me, what would it mean to trouble that kind of language? Which is why earlier I said I position Weems not as an example or as just a case study for an argument, but that Weems is a theorist, right? Like on her own accord.
A comment, not a question, from Sylvia Weisbord.
No, wait, Barbie. I wanted to copy the link to the New York Times Magazine article, and I made a mistake. I copied the previous message. Ignore that, please.
Oh, okay, I see.
I just wanted to copy the link to the New York Times Magazine article that you referred to, Barbie.
Oh.
That's for FYI. That's what I wanted to do, but I failed. So ignore that. Move on.
Okay. So can I? Do you want to read your own comment?
Me? No. It was not a comment. No. I copied something that I was there before. Forget about it.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize that. Of course, that was Sarah Jackson ×2. Okay. Are there any other questions or comments? Okay, I think we will wrap it up.
LaCharles, I want to thank you for an extraordinary hour and a half. I think we're all leaving a little bit richer and certainly a lot more questions than we may have come into this presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for being here. Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.